Are reproductive policies being used and weaponized against men? You damn right. And we better be clear about how it's happening before it goes way further than it already has been. What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Onyx Report, Black Masculinist news for the day. Hope everything's well with you. Hope your week is going well so far. Please make sure you support the channel. I am trying to hit 30,000 subscribers, so please make sure you go ahead and subscribe to the channel. But in lieu of that, as I always say in general, like, share, subscribe, join, and donate so we can continue to bring you independent black male thought. So today we're asking the question: are there reproductive policies that are being weaponized against black men? Well, men in general, but y'all know my focus is particularly on black men. We have a unique history. We live in a unique circumstance. That said, there are often issues that differentiate us from other groups of men. And I try to take that into account so that I can paint a picture of the reality of black male life, right? So today we're going to start. We're actually going to look at two policies that are on the table, as it were, and look at how it really has an impact on men. So that said, let's check it out. So this is Newsweek. As you can see, newsweek.com, dated July 21st of 2022. Women could sue person who got them pregnant under new proposal. So it reads: in the weeks after the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, the story of a 10-year-old Ohio girl who was raped and forced to cross state lines for an abortion became a flashpoint in the country's abortion debate. A ban on most abortions after around 6 weeks of pregnancy came into effect in Ohio hours after the court's ruling, with no exceptions for rape or incest. President Joe Biden and others pointed to the case as example of the harm caused by the court's decision, but some conservatives suggested the story was a hoax. The case was indeed real, confirmed by Columbus Dispatch's reporting that a man was arrested and arraigned in connection with the rape. Okay, and more cases like it are sure to follow in the post-Roe America, said Ohio State Senator Tina Maharath. It's going to have more devastating effects as young girls and women have to travel out of state to receive an abortion, she told Newsweek. But for those who are forced to carry unintended pregnancies to term, Maharath, and I may be mispronouncing that, a Democrat, has introduced legislation that would allow them to sue the person who got them pregnant, regardless of whether the sex was consensual or not. Yeah. So it would allow, right, a woman to sue a man regardless of whether or not the sex was consensual. So you had me up till rape, but consensual. Interesting. But for those who are forced to carry, so Maharath's bill says that a person may bring a civil action against another person who causes the person to have an unintended pregnancy, regardless of the circumstances, or aids or abets any other person in causing the person to have an unintended pregnancy, regardless of the circumstances. See, it's all this regardless of the circumstances crap that really, adds to this. According to Maharath's bill, someone who causes a pregnancy could be responsible for paying the plaintiff damages of at least $5,000, as well as court costs and attorney fees. With abortion severely restricted in Ohio, the state's poorest women and girls will struggle to pay the costs associated with getting an abortion out of state, Maharath said. But those costs will be even higher when they have to continue with a pregnancy they never wanted. The average cost of giving birth here in Ohio is over $15,000, and that's just a regular pregnancy, said Maharath, who gave birth herself in May. It can rise if there's complications. So they're using very, very distinct scenarios to draw a picture about what should happen in policy overall, right? So you're taking these 1% situations and trying to use that to justify painting a brush across a wide swath of the population, right? This whole question of, if you're impregnated unwillingly. And I find it interesting because to me, it's reminiscent of a circumstance where a man can be held, responsible for a pregnancy he didn't want. And the woman has been the one that's had all the choice, right? You get a woman pregnant, even with abortion in place, she gets to decide whether a one-night stand becomes a lifelong obligation for you or whether it doesn't. And you have nothing to say. You can't weigh in on the matter in any way. You can't even abstain from the entire situation with a financial abortion. You as a man have no right to say, I don't want to be a part of this, regardless of what she chooses. I should have and this is one of the things we push for the black male political agenda. We push for the right for a financial abortion. We push for the right for men to be able to decide if they want to participate in a pregnancy or not. Men don't have that choice. Women are able to invoke the court on their behalf, family court, to force men to participate even against their will. But now we've had this new policy, rolling back Roe versus Wade, and now women are opting for the power in Ohio to be able to sue. Interesting, right? Well, let's see if this is something that is kind of being extended beyond just this one issue. All right, let's see. There's another. Let's see this. So this one you can find in the Tennessean. All right. Shout out to those of you in Tennessee that listen to the Onyx Report. Hope you're well. My Pops is out there. Shout out, Pops. New proposed bill will protect Tennessee's parents from paternity fraud. This is an opinion piece written by guest columnist. Right? Representative Antonio Parkinson's proposed bill will ensure that the actual biological father is listed on the birth certificate of the child. Recently, I was approached by a young man who told me he had been in a long-term relationship. Together, they had a son, and he signed the Voluntary Acknowledgement of Paternity, VAP. They were not married. 5 years later, he found out the mother had been unfaithful during the time they were together. He and the child took a DNA test. The results proved that he was not the father. Subsequently, the relationship ended. The woman then sued him for child support. Right? So we're talking about whether there are reproductive policies that have been weaponized against men. Now, in the first one, they're trying to create a new policy. In this one, we're looking at policies that already exist, right? So, that being said, suing him for child support. Right? In juvenile court, he presented the DNA evidence to the magistrate that was basically told, somebody's got to feed him and it will be you. He was ordered to pay child support and found in arrears. Eventually, his license was suspended and he was pulled over and jailed for driving on a suspended license. Sitting in jail, he lost his job because he voluntarily signed, and it had passed a 5-year period to rescind the voluntary acknowledgement. He was deemed a legal parent. Through this process, the actual biological parent's child was stolen from him. Right? So it continues. Finally, under this scenario, the child's right to have their legal biological father listed on their birth certificate, and in some cases, their lives, was stolen from them also. Right? Biological parents need protection. Multiple reports state that 1/3 of the signatures on birth certificates from unmarried couples do not reflect the biological father's name. Under House Bill 2698/Senate Bill 1777, unwed fathers could still voluntarily sign, but in order for the birth certificate to be officially validated, the signer must provide the results of a DNA test to vital records. I want to read that first sentence again, and then we'll move on. Multiple reports state that 1/3 of the signatures on birth certificates from unmarried couples do not reflect the biological father's names. Now, that would include cases where the biological father, cases where those who take on a fatherly role, understand that that's not their child. I'm sure those cases are included. But I would argue there are probably a significant number of cases where men have been misled about the parentage of the child. Right? And hopefully, with DNA evidence as accessible as it is these days, more men can actually find out and make the decision if they want to participate in the raising of a child. Because again, this is a lifelong commitment of not just financial resources, but emotional ones. This is not a lightweight issue. And there are many men that take this extremely seriously, mainly because of the way we've experienced life, the way we were raised, the relationships we may have with parents. There are many men who take fatherhood very seriously. And sometimes that's exploited. But when you have policy that helps men be exploited, now we have a deeper problem. Because that puts all the power in the hands of somebody that may have manipulated the situation in the first place. And if that can land you in jail or jobless on a whim, that's fundamentally problematic, right? So when you talk about 1/3 of the signatures on birth certificates from unmarried couples do not reflect the biological father's name, that's a big deal. 1/3, right? 33%. How many of those are based on manipulation? We don't know. But it needs to be called out. So the article continues. This will ensure that the actual biological father is listed on the birth certificate of the child. The Tennessee Department of Human Services, who oversees the child support program, is fighting vigorously to kill the bill. Why? Because the department fears any changes in their enforcement rules could possibly jeopardize the $52 million in funding it receives from the federal government for its child support enforcement programs. In addition, DHS could also potentially receive millions more for reaching a quota of 90% acknowledged births, with yet another bonus out there for exceeding the quota. So this is key. Now we're finding out what the motivations are on behalf of the state, right? For just making sure whoever's name is on it, making sure that even men who aren't the biological parent, even men who've been lied to, and even men who can prove they've been lied to, are still left on the hook in replacement of the government itself. The reasons are that the state governments are actually funded by the federal government, over $50 million and more based on reaching quotas. Right? So there's no concern for the child. There's no concern for the accuracy of the birth certificates. There's no concern for the unjust situation that many a manipulated man finds himself in at the word of an unscrupulous woman who's using her position in the way she chooses to, regardless of the ethics of it, regardless of the circumstances. There's no protection for men in these situations. But all of this is incentivized by federal resources. That's the fundamental problem we're looking at here. Right? You know, these kind of these federal policies and these federal resources incentivize the state to be very uncaring about the circumstances of men, which further incentivizes women to do whatever's in their interest to do simply because they can. Right? So, and it continues. So there's a possibility of a huge financial motivation to turn a blind eye to individuals blindly signing the VAP form. The DHS program actually aids paternity fraud by allowing unsuspecting putative fathers to blindly sign a birth certificate without DNA proof of actual biological fatherhood. Now, I should say the black male political agenda that this channel created and supports, and I'll put the link in the description box so you can check it out for yourself. We are strong advocates of mandatory DNA testing at birth before the birth certificate is signed. In fairness to DHS, there's a 60-day grace period to remove your name from a birth certificate. Also, a father can contest paternity in court where a DNA test will be ordered. There is a 5-year period where one could go through the expensive legal process to rescind the voluntary acknowledgement of paternity, but they will have the burden of proving it was done fraudulently. It was after this 5-year period where the young man I was talking about was locked in legally for blindly signing the voluntary acknowledgement of paternity. All of this can be remedied by simply requiring a DNA test on the front end to alleviate any challenges and potential emotional scarring for the child, the wrongfully accused father, the mother, and the rightful biological father. We always hear the words, do what's best for the child. As a state, we should do just that, keep the child at the forefront and do what's best on the front end to minimize the pain and hurt on the back end. So that's what we're looking at. The circumstances that men face. But here's the thing. When we talk about, the weaponization of reproductive policies, it wouldn't be the first time. So again, we've covered 2 instances where we've seen this in place. The proposal of a new bill, right, that would allow women to sue men who have impregnated them, even if it was consensual sex. And the second one, even though the policy being proposed is one that actually helps to protect men from paternity fraud, the policies that are already in place don't really do that. If anything, we see the system being incentivized to work against the interests of men who are being manipulated into a role that they may not want to play, but feel like they're forced to. And as far as they know, legally are, right? So those are the ways we're seeing it being weaponized in terms of those two policies. Now, a number of years back, I wrote a piece on my blog. Now, the reason I use a blog is because a lot of the pieces that I write, they're not politically correct. They're not something that, people enjoy reading over coffee. Some people are greatly offended by the things I say because I advocate unapologetically for black men. And black men are the pavement of society as far as most are concerned, so they don't give a damn. I don't care. But I write on my blog so that I can freely say what I want to say and people can share it. And I don't have to wonder if someone's going to allow me to post it based on whether or not they like what I'm saying. I spent years pulling that bullshit. I will never do it again. So I write independently and share my thoughts as I see fit. On this particular link, now you'll find this in the description box as well, and you can scroll through the entire blog, newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com. And this particular article is dated October 29th, 2018, entitled why was Black Generation X Fatherless? A brief statement on why many black men left the family in the 1970s. I initially wrote this article because my generation, Gen X, we were highly frustrated at our fathers. We were the first generation to really be raised in a single parent context. Many of our fathers weren't there. We had strained relationships with our fathers. You could hear it in the hip hop music and even in some of the R&B at the time of the 80s and 90s, where you had frustrated Gen X men talking about their fathers not being present, so on and so forth. Then we became men ourselves. And we discovered in many instances that there was more to our father's experience than we were told. Some men were deadbeat dads. Some men are dads by force. And many men, no matter how they responded, whether responsibly or disappeared altogether as far as fatherhood was concerned, came to find that the bigger issue wasn't just about whether or not they were good men. It was about the way policy shaped their interactions, and more importantly, how much power policy gave to women. See, that's a lot of things. That's a lot of what we don't talk about in general. This is why I always advocate for any of you that haven't known your father to, if you can, find out the other side of the story. It doesn't exonerate him. It doesn't have to incriminate anybody else. But you getting both sides of the story gives you an opportunity to come to some inward balance. But also understand the larger macro social dynamic of this. What role policy, what role social behavior, what role the contracts we play in the social arena, what role all of those things play into how black families come together and sometimes break apart. So in this particular piece, I wrote this for black Gen X men who were frustrated at their fathers. And I explained the policies that helped shape the breaking down of the black family in the 1970s and 80s. Not during slavery, not during Reconstruction. The breakdown of the black family takes place between the 60s and the 80s, and it's still debilitatingly breaking down to this day. If you look at marriage rates, if you look at the quality of life, all of this inherited wealth, and there are other factors involved in that, but it is what it is, right? Now, when I start the article, one of the things I start with is a list of policies that had a huge impact on black men, right? I start off kind of talking about frustrated black men and kind of discovering why. But I wrote, in a short period of time between the 1960s and 70s, the following policies became ensconced in law, dramatically changing reality for black males nationally. So you had female excused military drafting policies, right? Now, those are not, founded in the 60s and 70s, I don't think, but I'm saying, nonetheless, during some critical wars from Korea to Vietnam, so on and so forth, you have a one-way drafting policy as far as men is concerned, right? That has an impact on black men. That had an impact. The Korean and Vietnam wars, most particularly, definitely had an impact on the role of fathers for the following generation. Female-centered welfare, the man in the house rule. The man in the house rule was a policy that meant that if you had a man in the house, you couldn't get welfare in many states. So it effectively incentivized the state and black women as the new heads of household, as far as the eyes of the law were concerned, to remove you from being present, right? So she could get access to those resources. And over time, I argue what took place multi-generationally was a debilitating perspective on black men and their value to the family. Because what that meant was each individual man had to compete with the United States government. Some men could do it. Many men can't, right? So that being said, those policies further debilitated the family, but more particularly helped to cultivate a perspective that men weren't necessary, right? Family-centered family court policy, right? And particularly the advent of no-fault divorce. So this created a dynamic where a woman could divorce you at any reason, for any reason, at any time, and with the help of the family court, generally get custody of the kids rather than a 50-50 custody being standard, which is what we propose in the black male political agenda. More often than not, custody was deferred to the woman, right? And she could further exact resources from you, whether it had to do with legal fees, attorney fees, or of course, child support, and any other ruling that worked on her behalf, like alimony. Now, we didn't see a dramatic rise in alimony, and that had to do with how feminists, didn't see the value of it early on, but they made up for it by increasing child support resources. So that said, this fleeced men's dollars that much more. And when you're talking about black male population, where employment is questionable and income is low, it's a big deal. If you're worth $1 million and you lose 500,000, you're gonna be pissed. But you're not worried about where your next meal is coming from. If you make 20,000 a year and you lose 10,000, that's a problem. That's a problem. And in the words of Chris Rock, I shouldn't have to move back in with my mama because you ain't happy. But that's the reality many black men faced, right? With the advent of no-fault divorce and the shift in family court policy that heavily advocated for women. Now, I'm going to skip the next one. I'm going to come back to it. You had female-centered Title IX, which basically dealt with sex discrimination. And although the language of the law is often written in a gender-neutral manner, the implementation of those policies has been heavily female deferring, gynocentric, right? Works on behalf of women, not necessarily on the behalf of men. Men haven't been able to cultivate a confidence that they can advocate on their own behalf when sexually discriminated against, whether at work or in the public or in relationships. Whether police take them seriously, whether courts take them seriously, whether, employee affairs at work. I'll remember that the proper name of that office the moment I in this video, but y'all know what it is, right? Whether they take those cases seriously is questionable. And if I ask men who are listening to this broadcast to comment on whether or not they've been taken seriously at work, at school, by the police in regard to families or in family courts as far as their treatment and their experiences with discrimination, many of you would be shocked, right? So female-centered Title IX policies further debilitated black men's capacity to use the courts, use the policies of the land to advocate on their behalf when treated unjustly, especially in terms of gender and discrimination issues. Need-based financial aid, and this had a lot to do with the war on drugs and the radical increase in incarceration rates in the 1970s and onward, further debilitated men from being able to access high-quality education, most particularly high-level education, college and beyond. Radically so. So much so that from 1976 to the current day, black men possess half the degrees black women do. And that's a fraction of the degrees that white women and white men do. And a lot of it had to do with the war on drugs, but a lot of it also has to do with the fact that many black men can't afford it and aren't supported from K through 12 to get it. Most particularly when we start talking about implicit bias, when we start talking about the ways in which black boys are routed into special ed very early on and no longer put on a college track. Yeah, this has a debilitating impact over generations, really, but definitely over a lifetime, right? A black female-centered affirmative action policy. This has to do with double minority status. What it means basically is that when companies are incentivized, just like we saw with the birth control, the paternity fraud policies as it relates to states, when private companies, when nonprofits even are jockeying for federal resources and affirmative action policies are framed the way they are, Companies are incentivized to check as many boxes as possible. And one of the things that did in the 1960s and 70s and beyond is it prioritized white women as the dominant affirmative action beneficiaries. But second to that were black women, because they were both women and black. This left black men, who were at one point the key figures being discussed in terms of affirmative action, now they were out of the running for the most part. White women took up the lion's share of resources as far as affirmative action, followed by black women. So we don't talk about white women's benefiting from this, which is really a product of generations of protest and activism. White women took the bulk of that, and black women got the rest. Black men found themselves not quite as sexy in regard to these policies because they couldn't check more than one box, being black. Because we really don't consider men a gender, males a gender, and for that matter, there are no policies that advocate. So even though black males tend to do worse than everybody else because they're not women, they're not LGBT, especially if heterosexual, and they're male. None of that constitutes that, right? We associate males with white, and thus the idea of privilege. There we go. Right? And then we have black female-centered media, which means that you can cultivate a way of looking at Black America through generations of media that prioritize her experiences, her interests, so on and so forth. And black males find themselves made out to be the boogeyman when allowed to be involved in the story at all. And now we're reaching a pinnacle point where, after decades of this, most particularly since the 1980s, black men are becoming absent from stories that used to center them. Check out the Black Panther if you don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, but the main one we're talking about in this instance is female-centered birth control. And the reason I bring up birth control is when we talk about its development, there's some key things that it ends up doing that impact us, right? So one of the things I talked about is, that black men found themselves prisoner to their own biology in ways that women were newly liberated from in the 1960s. Even contemporarily, if a man has an unwanted impregnation, people suggest he should have just kept it in his pants, right? That's what we hear colloquially. When a man gets somebody pregnant and he didn't plan to, doesn't want her to be pregnant, that's what we hear back. Oh, he just should have kept it in his pants. Okay. While ignoring that women have 5 major birth control options in about 30 different forms: hormonal methods, barrier methods, intrauterine methods, natural methods, and emergency contraception. That doesn't even include abortion, that apply before, during, and after the sex act. And that doesn't include, I just said that. So isn't this strangely reminiscent of when people told women they should have kept their legs closed before the pill? Right? Meanwhile, what do men have? Condoms, vasectomies, and abstinence. And that's in 2022. So when I talk about the weaponization of reproductive resources, what I'm saying in this instance is, even when we had the advent of the pill, right, and all these various forms of birth control that liberated women from their own biology. And what do I mean by that? It meant that they were no longer subject to just that. So even now, when we're hearing so much frustration around the overturning of Roe versus Wade, there's been no contemplation about the fact that men have long since been in a position where we had no reproductive choice. The idea was our choice was made when we had sex. Her choice isn't made when she had sex. She has other options, but it's okay that men's choice is limited to copulation, insemination, whether it was on purpose or by accident. Nobody has any pity or empathy for men who have gotten somebody pregnant accidentally, even if he took the steps he needed to try and prevent that. Sometimes condoms bust, and they're particularly faulty if somebody pokes holes in them for one reason or another, because we're going to pretend like there's no reproductive drive in women, right? And yet individual men, scores of them, will send me stories every year about that very thing. I am up to about 75 messages, if not 100 a day, from men about all kinds of issues, and this is one that comes up often. 7 days a week, ain't no breaks. So what I'm saying to you is, men have long since not had any reproductive options, and that's been considered okay by everybody's standard. Even with abortion off the table in some states, meaning women can go to other states to still get it, men still have the goddamn pull-out method, and nobody cares, because we don't apply the same kind of cold logic to women that we do men. So here we are watching people screaming and crying about the loss of Roe v. Wade, and men are still damn near, it's almost like, it's It's almost like watching men have to start fires with sticks, and women are living in houses with HVAC units and heat. You know, it's damn near like that when it comes to birth control options. And it's okay, as far as most people are concerned. So here I'm talking about the weaponization of the lack of birth control resources for men, pharmaceutical and otherwise. Right? So there was a particular period in time post 1960s where I argue that men did suffer a very particular type of weaponization in regard to birth control resources by not having any given to them, right? By giving all of them and developing all of them strictly for the women, that's a very particular type of weaponization, because it left everyday men at to the disposal, or I should say to the whim of whomever they may have gotten pregnant. And all he could do is stand there and cross his fingers and hope that she would either have the baby he wanted or not have the baby he didn't want. And that was it. He could recommend, he could say something, but that was it. So now we have new policies that are being developed as Roe v. Wade is being turned down. And all these policies, for the most part, still female leaning, except for the one that we're talking about from the Tennessean, where they're talking about finding new ways to prevent paternity fraud. But people are still boldly trying to create policies that work to the benefit of women, as if men have options. And somehow the bill to give women the right to sue men who get them pregnant, whether it's consensual or not, like this somehow balances society in some way that, it keeps men and women on the same plane when it comes to birth control. Hell no. Hell no. Men are still starting fires with sticks in terms of that. My only birth control is costs $20 at a CVS. That's the only birth control I get. Piece of rubber. Really? Okay. Interesting. But my point is simply that we have to be mindful of how these policies are being proposed. We have to be able to look at the history of birth control, be it pharmaceutical or otherwise, be it pharmaceutical or policy-based is what I really mean to say. We have to be mindful of how these things affect us. And we have to actually talk to the young men, our sons, our nephews, our mentees, and be clear about how these policies can dramatically impact their lives. Because in this country, we've spent the last half century advocating for women in this regard and giving them the power, legally speaking, to decide the fate of most men. In this instance, in this space. And it's a problem. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Please go ahead and respond in the comments section. Y'all have a good one. Peace.